high in Bavarian Alps, where the clouds hang low and the wind carries the faint echo of war, there once stood a world built on beauty and terror. Inside those mountain villas, surrounded by snow-draped pines and panoramic views of the valleys below, a circle of women laughed, posed for photographs, and drank afternoon tea as Europe burned beneath them. They were wives, lovers, daughters, and confidantes. Yet behind their soft smiles lay a devotion that helped sustain one of the darkest regimes in human history. To the outside world, they appeared harmless. But were they truly innocent? Or were they willing accomplices who embraced privilege while ignoring, excusing, or encouraging brutality unfolding just beyond their windows? Their stories begin not on the battlefield, but in living rooms, ski chalets, and candlelit halls at Obersalzberg, Hitler's private sanctuary. From Eva Braun's quiet longing, to Gretel Braun's glittering social life, to Magda Goebbels' chilling loyalty, each woman reflected a different face of the Third Reich's inner circle. As the war approached its violent end, their comfortable world collapsed into ash and silence. This is the hidden war behind the war, the rise, devotion, and final ruin of the Nazi elite's most intimate circle. The rise of these women began long before the world knew their names. Their stories were shaped by a nation wounded after World War I, hungry for identity, desperate for order, and vulnerable to the promises of a movement that wrapped hatred in the language of destiny. As the Nazi Party grew, it did not simply attract soldiers, bureaucrats, and ideologues. It drew in families. It drew in young women who saw in Hitler's world a strange blend of romance, purpose, and belonging. To Adolf Hitler, women were not meant to argue policy or shape statecraft. They were meant to embody racial purity, raise children, and project the idealized softness of the Aryan home. Yet in practice, the women who gathered around her became far more than symbols. They became stabilizing anchors for the men who built the machinery of war. They became guardians of the private spaces where strategy, ambition, and cruelty mingle behind closed doors. Among them was Eva Braun, a 17-year-old shop assistant who first saw Hitler in the studio where she worked. She knew little of politics, and even less about the man who would change her life. What she understood was loneliness, both his and her own. Their relationship began not with power, but with silence, longing, and a dangerous desire to be seen. Her early suicide attempts did not push Hitler away. They bound her to him. By the early 1930s, Eva lived in a private world designed to isolate her from the German public, a shadow queen in a kingdom of secrets. Her younger sister, Gretel Braun, stepped into a different role. Outgoing, flirtatious, and comfortable among officers, Gretel thrived in the social atmosphere of Obersalzberg. She became part of a growing court on the mountaintop, dinners, dances, skiing excursions, and afternoon gatherings filled with adjutants, secretaries, and high-ranking officials. Hitler's Alpine retreat, the Berghof, was not just a headquarters. It was a stage where loyalty was measured, friendships were forged, and power was quietly traded. Beyond the Braun sisters, other women rose alongside the regime. Gerda Bormann, upbringing steeped in nationalist fervor, married Martin Bormann, and raised 9 children in strict adherence to Nazi values. To her, devotion to Hitler was a sacred duty. Magda Goebbels, elegant and ambitious, saw in the movement not only ideology, but also a path to status. Her home became a salon of influence, a place where propaganda and personal charm intertwined. Each woman brought something different: beauty, intellect, obedience, or fierce ideological passion. By the late 1930s, Obersalzberg had transformed into an alpine stronghold of the Nazi elite. Villas lined the mountain. SS guards patrolled every path. Tea houses overlooked vast blue lakes. It was a world suspended above reality, protected, privileged, and detached from the suffering that was already beginning across Europe. From these idyllic slopes, their stories took shape. Their loyalties hardened, their identities fused with the men they loved. History's darkest chapter had already opened, and they were standing at its threshold, ready to step inside. By the early 1940s, Obersalzberg had become the beating heart of Nazi privilege, an alpine sanctuary where the war felt distant, almost unreal. While cities across Europe smoldered under bombing raids, the mountaintop glowed with warm lights, polished interiors, and the clinking of crystal glasses. The elite gathered there as though the world below existed only in whispers. This was their gilded cage, an escape built on the suffering of millions. For Eva Braun, the Berghof was where she finally occupied a space close to the man she adored. Her days blended photography sessions, long walks along mountain paths, and evenings of film screenings and music. She held no official power, yet her presence softened the private world of Adolf Hitler. To his inner circle, she was the lady of the Obersalzberg, a quiet but constant figure who shaped the mood of the household. Here, Eva felt visible, perhaps for the first time in her life. Her sister, Greta Braun, embraced a different rhythm. The Alpine retreat was her playground. Soldiers returning from the front arrived with stories, medals, and confidence, and Gretel moved among them with ease. She flirted, danced, and reveled in the glamour the regime afforded its chosen few. It was within this atmosphere of privilege that she met Hermann Fegelein, a decorated SS cavalry officer whose charm masked a history written in blood. Fegelein was handsome, ambitious, and opportunistic, a man who understood that proximity to Hitler meant survival and influence. Their courtship was swift, convenient, and deeply symbolic of the era. Pleasure entwined with power, affection overshadowed by brutality. What Fegelein brought to Obersalzberg was more than charisma. His unit had carried out mass executions in Poland and Belarus, actions he spoke with cold detachment. Around him, the war's atrocities bled into the Alpine calm, even as the elite continued to drink, laugh, and pose for photographs on snowy slopes. The pinnacle of this double life came on June 3, 1944, when Gretel and Fegelein were married in the marble hall of Salzburg's Mirabel Palace. Himmler himself officiated the ceremony. The inner circle arrived in their finest uniforms. The chandeliers glowed, and the reception moved to the Berghof, where a famous picture window framed the mountains like a painting. From there, the wedding party continued up to the Eagle's Nest, where they celebrated for 3 days at the top of the world. But the world outside had reached its turning point. On June 6, 1944, as the laughter still echoed through the stone halls of the Eagle's Nest, news broke that Allied forces had landed in Normandy. D-Day sliced through the festivities like a blade. The illusion fractured. Fear crept into conversations. The sense of invincibility, so carefully cultivated at Obersalzberg, began to crumble. Even then, many of the women clung to the life they had built. Magda Goebbels continued to stand beside her husband as propaganda intensified. Gerda Bormann, unwavering in her ideological devotion, urged her children to believe in the Reich's destiny. Around them, officers whispered about retreat, betrayal, and defeat. For a moment, the mountain remained beautiful, but the view was no longer comforting. It was a reminder of how far they were about to fall. By early 1945, the illusion of the Alpine paradise had shattered. The war had come home. One by one, the women of the inner circle were forced to confront a truth they had long ignored. The Reich they believed would last 1,000 years was collapsing in a matter of weeks. And the men they had followed so loyally were no longer symbols of strength, but fading shadows in underground corridors. Berlin, once the capital of their empire, had become a labyrinth of rubble and fire. Deep beneath the ruined chancellery, in the concrete labyrinth of the Führer bunker, the final act of their private world unfolded. Eva Braun, who could have fled to safety, chose instead to return to Hitler's side. Her decision was not political. It was emotional, born from years of longing for a place in his life. Now, in the dim light of the bunker, she finally became the partner she believed she was meant to be. Above ground, the Red Army tightened its grip on the city. Inside, Hitler deteriorated, issuing impossible orders to divisions that no longer existed. Amid this unraveling, Hermann Fegelein made his choice. Pragmatic to the point of ruthlessness, he attempted to flee Berlin with another woman. Suitcases packed with money, civilian clothes, and forged identity papers. When Hitler demanded his presence, Fegelein was found drunk at his apartment, an act that sealed his fate. Eva pleaded for her brother-in-law. Gretel was heavily pregnant, but mercy had no home in those final days. Fegelein was court-martialed, stripped of his medals, and executed in the shattered garden above the bunker. The tragedy did not end there. In a room lit by a single lamp, Magda Goebbels faced a choice far darker than Fegelein's. Believing a world without National Socialism was unworthy of her children, she administered morphine to each of her 6 young sons and daughters, then placed cyanide capsules between their small teeth. It was a decision born from fanatic devotion, and its horror still echoes through history. She and Joseph Goebbels walked into the garden afterward, where they ended their lives the same way their leaders soon would, by poison and gunfire, bodies set ablaze in a final act of denial. In the bunker's inner chamber, Hitler finally granted Eva Braun the marriage she had begged for. It was a quiet, eerie ceremony. No music, no flowers, only the faint rumble of artillery. Less than 40 hours later, they ended their lives together. Eva bit into a cyanide capsule. Hitler raised a pistol to his temple. Their bodies were carried up the narrow stairs, soaked in gasoline, and burned in the garden as Soviet troops closed in. Beyond Berlin, the rest of the women faced their own unraveling. Gretel Braun, widowed and ashamed, gave birth to her daughter days after the Reich fell. Gerda Bormann succumbed to cancer in exile. Margaret Himmler and her daughter Gudrun were interrogated, their loyalty unbroken. Some retreated into obscurity. Others clung to ideology long after the smoke of war had cleared. The empire they helped nurture was gone, but the consequences of their choices were only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world faced a new kind of reckoning. Allied troops advancing across Germany expected to confront the architect of the Third Reich, men like Himmler, Goebbels, Bormann, and Göring. Instead, they often found their wives, mistresses, and children waiting in the ruins. The men were dead, missing, or attempting to flee. The women remained. And suddenly, the question of responsibility became far more complicated. For American and British interrogators, these women posed a moral riddle. Were they uninformed bystanders, sheltered from the realities of genocide? Or were they beneficiaries, and in some cases believers, in the ideology that fueled it? The Nuremberg trials focused primarily on male leadership, but the women orbiting them could not be ignored. Their lives were intertwined with the machinery of power. The villas they lived in, the jewels they wore, the servants they commanded were all byproducts of a system built on brutality. The Americans approached these cases with caution. In the early months of occupation, investigators interviewed Margaret Himmler and her daughter Gudrun, probing for knowledge of mass executions, deportations, and concentration camp policies. Gudrun, then a teenager, insisted her father had been an honorable man. She maintained this belief until her death in 2018, and later helped support former SS members through an underground network known as Silent Help. Her story became a troubling example of how extremist ideologies can survive long after their regimes collapse. American intelligence also interrogated Ilse Hess, wife of Rudolf Hess, and Hedwig Pothast, Himmler's mistress. Some cooperated. Others are behind tears or silence. Many claimed ignorance, yet their letters, diaries, and post-war behavior suggested otherwise. They had lived in privilege made possible only by persecution. They had benefited from stolen wealth, forced labor, and the violent restructuring of Europe. Still, the Allied courts struggled to prosecute them. The legal system required direct evidence of wrongdoing, a signature, a command, a documented act. Most of these women exercised influence behind closed doors, in private spaces where history's paper trail grows thin. As a result, several walked free with light sentences or none at all. This outcome angered many Americans, especially those who had liberated the camps and witnessed the devastation firsthand. But the United States learned something vital from these encounters. Evil does not operate only through generals and officers. It moves quietly through homes, marriages, and whispered conversations. It thrives when ordinary people embrace comfort over conscience. And long after the war ended, the lingering presence of these women reminded the world that responsibility does not disappear with the fall of a regime. It is carried forward, sometimes inherited, sometimes denied, but always waiting to be confronted. In the end, the story of these women is not a footnote to history. It is a mirror, a reminder that the private world behind a dictatorship can be as revealing, as destructive, and as morally decisive as the battlefields themselves. On the mountain terraces of Obersalzberg, among the laughter, the photographs, and the glittering evenings, it was easy for them to pretend the world outside did not exist. But history does not forgive such illusions. The smoke rising from Berlin in 1945 was more than the collapse of a regime. It was a final consequence of years spent choosing comfort over conscience. It is tempting to view these women as victims of circumstance, swept into the tides of a violent era. And some indeed were young, sheltered, or emotionally fragile. But their proximity to power was not an accident. Many embraced the ideology with conviction. Many encouraged the men beside them. And nearly all benefited from the suffering of others, sometimes unknowingly, often knowingly, always unavoidably. Their stories remind us that evil does not always appear with a raised voice or a clenched fist. It often enters quietly, through admiration, loyalty, and a desire to belong. It can wear a silk dress as easily as a uniform. It can dance at a wedding in Salzburg one night and look away from a burning village the next. And when faced with truth, it can retreat into denial, silence, or nostalgia. For America and for the world, the lesson endures. Authoritarianism feeds on the choices of ordinary people, on their loyalties, their fears, and their willingness to ignore what they do not want to see. The women of the Nazi inner circle show how private devotion can become public disaster, how personal illusions can fuel historical tragedy. Today, the villas of Obersalzberg stand empty. The eagle's nest overlooks peaceful valleys, and the bunker beneath Berlin is buried beneath concrete and time. But their ghosts remain not to haunt us, but to warn us, because history asks each generation the same question these women once faced. When darkness rises, will you turn away, or will you choose to stand against it, even when it costs you everything?